Thanks, Kelsey. And thanks everyone for coming. And after the fall break too, so I appreciate that. And actually there's kind of a problem with a couple of the phrases in the title. Like verbal art is one. And the other would be polysynthetic. The verbal art varies quite a bit cross-culturally. And so this subtitle, can you have single word poetry? And part of me says, oh, absolutely. But also just the idea of poetry is problematic because it's a concept in one culture, a group of cultures that isn't necessarily widespread. And so there's so many other factors into saying whether or not something is verbal art or poetry or whatever. And particularly important, one of the things I'm interested in context. Now, some people are more interested in how different cultures differ in their use of artistic language. Others look for commonalities, things that are widespread or ideally universal. And in my academic upbringing, I was trained more in looking for differences rather than universals. But the field of linguistics itself, the idea of looking for universals is dominant in the field. And so I have a little bit of that in me as well. But today I'll be looking at what you might think of as peculiarities, at least from our point of view. The idea of it, art conforming or challenging a system. I think confirming or challenging, the idea of challenge is actually not very widespread. It's actually more modern Western art. Polysynthetic refers to types of languages that have a lot of, the words are very complex, especially the verbs, and they have a lot of meaningful parts to them, what linguists call morphemes. And then so the words can stand alone as sentences. And certain languages allow you to have these sentences be very beautiful or affective with an A, as well as an E. The polysynthetic languages often incorporate nouns into the verbs, and I'll give you some examples of that. These languages are all over the world, but not exactly common. They're more concentrated in the Americas, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Siberia, just a few places in the world. But actually there's a continuum from languages that have no or very little morphology, like Chinese, for example, to those that are polysynthetic. And so this classification that some people do, I think is not totally useful. But if there's any group of languages that are polysynthetic, it's the languages I work with. Okay, a little bit on the differences. Sapir is famous for saying that Algonquian, using an older spelling of the word, the Algonquian languages, the verb is what he called tiny images, poems. It's a profound thing to say. The Algonquian languages would be like Miami spoken in this area, Ojibwe to the north, Cree, and it's very widespread, like the Athabascan languages. But I've done a little bit with Algonquian languages, not anywhere near as much with Athabascan. And the Algonquian languages are like nothing, working with them after Athabascan is like playing tennis without a net in terms of polysynthesis goes. And then, as I said, well, I didn't say, but Sapir is more interested in how different cultures differ. And so he says that every language and culture has its own language aesthetic built into the structure of the language itself, and things that speakers of the language can exploit, phonetic, rhythmic, symbolic, and so on. Roman Jakobson was a little more interested in the similarities with languages, not some exactly universals, but one thing he did say about the universals would be very general things. And he said the creative use of a language either celebrates or rebels against structural elements of the language. Actually, he didn't say that, I did, but it's a summary of what he did. And this is what he said. I'm not going to read all this. But he was very interested in Western languages, much more so than Sapir was, and but not just literary forms, but things. He looked at Russian riddles, Russian poetry, and so on. It wasn't just elite use of language, but in the Western tradition, I said more recently people are rebelling against form and structure, and that's a little bit rare. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Koyukon people, which is in central Alaska. It's remote. The school district in which it occurs is this area in here, which is larger than most states. So the Koyukon area is larger than most states, but it has only probably fewer than 1,000 people living in it. There are no roads there. It's along the Yukon and Yukon River there, and the Kayukuk River there. It belongs to a broader language family, the Athabascan language family. This map isn't entirely accurate. This coastal area is not Athabascan. It's distantly related to Athabascan, but not Athabascan. The Athabascan people, with the exception of the Tenaina, don't like to live on coasts. They like to live on rivers, including, you can't tell, but in the family extends down to Washington, Oregon, California, and into the Southwest with Navajo and Apache. The Navajo and Apache don't like to live along rivers. That's changed, but everywhere else they do. One Navajo person told me in his culture it was taboo to eat fish. Have you heard that?
No, but they don't eat fish very much.
Yeah.
I know a few that would fish for trout in the mountains, but it was very uncommon.
Yeah. That's like totally unheard of for Athabascan people. Okay, a little bit on the Koyukon language aesthetic. So some people are considered better at the creative use of language than others, although anyone can do it, any age, any gender, and so on, but it tends to be older people because they've spent a lifetime, honing the skill, as it were. And they're not specialists. They don't have any poet class or artist class or anything like that. It's it's an egalitarian society, but different people have different status. So as I said, some people are better at it. They also tend to be better at other things as well. And people who are good at a number of things have a lot of status, including what they call wealth. And there's a word for it. It's translated as wealth, but it really refers to having a lot of food. Like if you can get a lot of food, especially if you can share it with other people, then you're a good person. And then ideally, you also can use language well. You can compose songs. You're good at hunting, beadwork, sewing, whatever it is. And also, there's just a need in terms of traditional culture to have really good skills of observation and to be able to synthesize things. and you'll be able to figure things out, deal with new situations, resourcefulness, and so on. And the creative use of language in their mind is tied into that. And I'll explain how in a bit. Some of the skills that are valued, pithiness, the ability to say something profound, ideally, in short, concise a way as possible. If you could do it in a single word, that's like perfect. You really nailed it. And then also associative skills. I mentioned that before, but being able to see connections between things that other people don't see. And then observational skills about the social, but also about the natural environment. Really fine details, the sounds certain things make, what they look like. And then creativity, to say something that no one's said before. In terms of the language structure I'll be looking at today, I mean, there's so much, but in terms of the verb, I mentioned incorporation, so I'll give you some examples of that and how you can use that creatively. The other, what are called classificatory verb stems. These are, I don't know of any other language family that does this. A lot of languages classify things, but you have these verb stems that refer to the physical nature of something. It could be the object if it's a transitive sentence, or if there's no direct object, that would be the subject. And so the single verb stem can be used, depending on the verb prefixes, to mean for something to be in position, like a rock to be sitting there, or to being handled in some way. So there isn't exactly a word for carry or to give. They're all with verb prefixes in these classificatory verb stems. You have this meaning. Oh, and the other is tense and aspect, but I'm not going to say much about that. Prefixes and suffixes on the verb stem indicate such things as whether, like if you say he chopped wood, or just, he chopped wood, you could say that in Athabascan with a single word, but you could also tell by the aspect whether it was a single chop or successive chops, or successive stops and then you stopped again and did some more, or did a single stop, or whether you do it on a regular basis, or where you're walking along, a row of logs, chopping each one once or many times. So I'll give you some examples of incorporation. So this is a single word, ta. So this is the wind caused it'd be like a tree or dead tree or something, to break and fall into the river. So the ta prefix here means into the water. Is incorporated noun for wind. Ye is the thing that fell, direct object here, lay, completed action, the aspect, and then yitz, break. Athabascan place names are, whether regardless of, say, Apache or Koyukon, are very often built on verbs and paint very precise pictures of the nature of the place, and they're highly valued in terms of how descriptive they are in the imagery they evoke. So, and in their minds, place names are poetry. Keith Passo wrote some articles about Western Apache place names. They're really interesting, and he saw people like out mending fences, just sort of talking to themselves, and they're saying place names because they said they're good to say. Like it's like saying poetry, except you're saying place names. I mean, the idea is foreign to us. Like going Kokomo, Fort Wayne, or whatever. And so you could put din, a place where the wind caused something to fall into the river. Another incorporation, tsa means out into the open. Chotl is a sled. Cha, third person plural, complete action. Kat is stretched or taut. So this tells you they didn't come like as a bunch of sleds. They were in a line, like a stretched taut coming out into the open. This is a great prefix. Well, there are many great prefixes. It would be like if you walk out of the woods or come, not out of a house. That's a different one for that. It's also used to wake up, like lit, which means to wake up. So, and lit is like mental activity. So like your mind comes into the open, lit. I tried to say that once, and I said lits, and lits is the stem for urinate. So everyone thought that was really funny, like peeing out, and they understood. It made sense, but it's like as peeing out into the open or something, from like standing in the woods out into the field or something. Okay. Oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? Okay. These are examples of classificatory stems. So these, sachal is sugar. It's a loan word from Russian, sakhar. But so if it's in cube form, this is a classifier for a compact object. So this would be a sugar cube. This is plural objects. This would be sugar cubes or bags of sugar. There's a different one for granulation. This is for a long, rigid object. So this would be a canister of sugar. Would be in an open container. This would be like a bowl of sugar. That's a compact object with rigid prefix, so that'd be a box of sugar. This is for plural, but in a disorderly state. So sugar cubes would be, sachalidla would be like sugar cubes may be stacked or put in some kind of neat way, and atlitzok would be just sort of scattered about. And then tlach, there should be another K at the end of that. That was a typo. Atlitlach is for mushy object. You could say that. These aren't. You could say that, for example, a drunk person or a sloppy person. They're just sitting there in a mushy state. But this would be like wet sugar. And then granulation. It's something in granular form, has a different classifier. And then you can combine these. So the stem, this isn't classificatory, but just the verb for it's raining is alkan. And then there's a noun kan, which means rain. You can incorporate that. This is for, is a stem for a singular rigid object moves. So this would be like the rain comes down and it's like a hard rigid sheet, like that. And this is for usually used for plural humans moving, but it's like individuated objects, boom, 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 like big raindrops. De la would just be plural objects. Nakant de la, it's like pouring rain, plural objects, but not the big drops, individuated. Nakant de hoi, this is like a singular, usually human moves. This is like a sheet of rain, but not in a rigid form. They're very fine distinctions. And then this is not classificatory, but another way of saying rain. And there are many others actually, but this is water. This would be like, would be like strike against, like a drum or something. So the water's drumming. And then you can do also both. This is how you say if someone gets fired, like she or he fired him or her. You have incorporated noun for ice and the classificatory verb for compact object. And so this would be like to take someone else, you can put them into, freeze them in a little block and then take them out, like that, you're fired. And then you're out in the cold. Okay, the context for the artistic use of language. Mostly I'll be talking about the first four. Actually, probably that's all I'll talk about. I'll probably run out of time, as I always do. But the riddles, songs, speeches, stories, and so on, they're used in names, place names, also to avoid, like you don't want to say something directly, so you'll get creative with your language use. And also making observations about things. Maybe someone can ask me a question about observations if I don't get to it. So there's some interesting things about that. Okay, a little bit about the riddles called Kultzacht. Kultzacht is a word for riddles, like it's a verb, he or she riddles. I don't really understand why it means that, because tzach is a stem for cry, it's like crying something. And they're actually, the riddle telling sessions are, people laugh, it's a really happy occasion. They're done in, toward the end, after the, when the days start getting longer. Before that you tell the traditional stories, and then up until when it starts to thaw, then you tell the riddles. I say here they're mostly memorized. People do make them up, but a lot of people just repeat ones that they've heard, and there are a lot of them. Jeté was a Jesuit missionary who wrote a lot about the Koyukon people. He wrote an article on riddles, and the ones he includes there are ones that, Chief Henry, Eliza Jones recorded Chief Henry's riddles in 1976. Some of them are almost the same. The same in terms of meaning, not exactly the same words. But the riddles, even though they can be made up and they're memorized, and so that wouldn't be creative, but they're viewed as being training for the creative use of language and for your powers of observations. Like you see connections between things, and you hear those and you hone your skills. So this is, let's see if the sound works here. The sound doesn't work. And I'm not sure why, but. I wonder, I'm not going to try to figure this. I'll just, but this is Eliza Jones doing an interview. And then she says, it talks about the words used in riddles are more complex than ordinary language. And it's the same kind of words that people use in making songs, giving names to people, and so on. And then she talks about the powers of observation. You have to use your imagination, like you look at a snowshoe and personify it, or looking the birch bark or listening to the birch bark flapping in the wind and so on. I guess the sound is. I just, since I already told it to you, I thought the sound didn't work. Okay, so this is one of the riddles. Do you use was all dish. It didn't. You don't. We're whistling along the edge of the bank, but we didn't used to whistle a long time ago. And the answer to this is a piece of birch that's been loosened, but is still attached, and when the wind blows through it, it whistles. So this is yisk, incorporated noun for whistling. A thematic prefix is what that basically means here is I don't want to bother explaining it, so you'll see that a few times. This is we, personified in this case, progressive. This actually is weird because this would be, and the progressive would be like to go along whistling. So you could incorporate, if you say you use was all dish, this would be saying like people, and a bunch of people walking along whistle, like that, everyone whistling. Or you could use it, one for talking, like people walking along talking, or singing, like people walking along singing. And so even though the birch is stuck on the tree, it's treating like it's moving along, and I'm not exactly sure why. Okay. And then here's another one. Not astaldig. Far upstream, a piece of charcoal is walking. That's a weasel tail. So if the weasel is far enough away, you don't see the weasel swimming across, just a little black tip of the tail. So you knew not estoldi. It's an incorporated word for charcoal. Again, this is plural humans. I don't know why, since it's just a single weasel. Okay, I'll move on now to the traditional stories. Adon Sydney are what folklorists would call myths, which are sacred stories in the sense that they explain the world as it is today. And so in these stories, you'll sometimes see, or not sometimes, but depending on the storyteller, often see creative use of language. And again, some people are better at it than others. Some people just sort of give a synopsis of the plot, and other people give really fine, vivid details. And people can do that are highly valued. These are traditionally told in the winter and late fall, before the days begin to lengthen. Traditionally told in the evening, which means it's dark, and so they're told in the dark. And so I think this increases the effectiveness of the imagery, the stories, like if you can't see anything. Anyone can tell a story, as I said, but some people are better at it. Okay, so this is one of my favorite words in the story. The myth. In this story, a woman's husband kills her family, and she finds out, and he tries to kill her. She gets away, but he kills the baby, and so she's out alone. And being alone in the interior of Alaska is not a good thing to be. Okay. And so she comes to, even in the summer, and the story takes place in the summer, but she comes to an abandoned village site, and she hears a voice from the ground saying, this, dig me back up, dig me up. And someone knowing the language would know, just from that word, that it's a round, rigid object. So its classificatory stem for compact object. And the prefix is deni, indicates it's round and rigid in addition. So it could be like a bowling ball or a grapefruit, but in this case it's a skull. So the skull's saying, dig me back out. This is what a grapefruit would say to you if it wanted you to take it out of the grocery bag. Okay, if it's Bokoika and could speak. This is another one that has the metonym for one for many. In this story, this guy is attacked by a huge blueberry that comes flying from the sky. And he clubs it and kills it. And so they have this dead blueberry. And so it's like a bunch of people camp next to it and live off for a long time. And so the people camping is indicated by this word. So what this means is many people camped, but what it literally means is a single piece of wood fell down. And so there's a metonym for one for many. Like if you pick berries, you'll use a plural, but if you picked a huge load of berries, you would say, I picked a berry. That means just an inordinate amount of berries. And so this would be indicates there's a whole bunch of campfires around this blueberry. It must have been very big. I keep wanting to tell you the rest of the stories, but In this one, there's this one story that takes like 3 weeks to tell, so I won't tell you that story. But this guy travels, and he one of the first encounters, it might have been the first one actually, goes to camp. People are camp robbers, which Canada J, Grey J. And they don't have much to eat, and so they want to share their food with him, and so they bring in like 4 fish eggs, you know, which are quite small, and make soup out of it. Make a broth out of the soup egg. And so you drink, you know, eat. And then he has some, and finally one little fish egg floats, you know, goes into his mouth. And then he says, which is totally culturally inappropriate to like speak critically of food you're being offered. But he says, finally a little chunk of something floated into my mouth. But it literally means is the water carried a little round compact object into my mouth, in this case a fish egg. Normally and this is, I don't think, one time was creative, but normally people come up when they tell stories entirely new words. But this one is kind of a set phrase now. And so people will say that if they're drinking weak soup. You know, when people started getting Campbell's soup, you know, professional soup, produced soup from cans, they're really impressed of how weak the soup was. And so they'll say that they're drinking some Campbell's soup or something, you know, find a little piece of something floated into my mouth, little teeny piece of chicken or whatever. They like soup with all kinds of stuff in it. Ideally starting with a moose head, and then just what else? Yeah. Okay. The memorial dance songs. The lyrics of the songs are very often, usually just vocables, which are meaningless syllables. And then in addition to that, there's really difficult to understand words, which offering some praise or lamentation for the people whose dance. These are sung at potlatches. There are different kinds of potlatch songs. I forget about the Zatachalik now. They're not usually understood, but this is something like, we depended on him, but on him Yeni Zadlio. It literally means we extended our minds to him. It's a person who passed away. He was a wealthy person in the sense, had a lot of food and shared it with other people. And so they depended on him in that respect, but their minds extended to him. It's a little hard to, and this also, I didn't have that, but to be in a state of extending the mind is, okay, this is a little bit of a song. Let's see if the sound works now. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I was kind of, if you're trying to sing along, I was a little unsteady there. But this is, I don't see, and this would be unlike like Navajo and Apache that have a lot of parallelism. Koyukon really doesn't do parallelism. It's different, but this is, one respect, parallelism and even rhyme in this song. So you have, it's you would be grandmother's. There's a typo, there should be an S. And that's the out of the open one again. Koskat would be riches. Danilo, to handle plural objects. Pay no attention to the hyphens. So this is all one word. Koskat Danilo. Hotzim means from an area. Then the place, so what this means is the place from which her grandmother's brought out wealth, which would be potlatch food. Kot means wealth. From the place where in the huts, and from that place, she who is the light of her grandmother's flame, again, out into the open, to bring light out into the open. So you have kind of the incorporated noun, and then Dani Lo versus Lani Yo, so even rhyming there. So this is Puskat, wealth, thematic, I don't want to talk about tense, classificatory stem for plural objects. And then out into the open, the light, to bring a singular objects. Or this means probably something not she used to bring out, but the light used to come out because of her, something like that. Just a few more lyrics and song. Good fortune surrounded him, incorporated noun for a mob, like a whole bunch of people usually. Like he was like mob with good fortune, in a rigid form. It's like packed around him. I hope I'm not going too fast. Is everyone okay? Okay. I often do that to my poor students. We'll make merry for his good hunt. This one I don't understand. It's a classificatory object of reversative form, which is use things like turn over or to wash. Not exactly rub, but to turn something over. So it's kind of like turning over the happiness again. Okay, potlatch speeches. They're held traditionally the year after someone dies. They take usually 5 days or so. There's songs, singing, dancing together. People give speeches, and they distribute food and other goods, usually yard goods, especially to the people who helped at the time of the person's death. Like maybe someone who found the body or helped take care of the body or brought food to the bereaved or whatever. The speeches would not usually be understood by everyone. And so there would be like speech contests in a sense. The kind of like you're competing with the other speaker, but at the same time offering thanks if you're the host, or sympathy and condolences, comfort to the host if you're a guest. But if someone will say some very abstract, creative thing, and then you, in your responding speech, you indicate that you understood it and kind of up the ante a little bit, and then the other person will respond to that. And then if they can't respond, then you sit. It's called you sit someone down, like they don't get up to speak. All in the context of like a condolence and thanks. So there's a very warm feeling about it. Okay, there are a lot of words up here, which I won't read, but basically that's what I just said. This is a little bit of speech. This old woman who's talking about it, someone asked her about high language, like this creative use of language, and she says, I don't really know it. My father did. Which it could mean she doesn't know it or doesn't think so. Could also mean she's being humble, which is also very common, like to know. This potlatch where she was speaking was a year after this young couple died in a plane crash. And she's talking about how, in the speech, she talks about how things were difficult enough before people from outside came and brought things like airplanes, like all the way we suffered before. This is adding new suffering to us. A person Khoisan person talking about this speech said she was probably not just talking about airplanes, but other social ills as well, such as alcohol and gambling and so on. And then before this takes, she's talking about how, don't think she's been to this village before. And talking about when she was young, she wanted to go. Her husband used to come here because he worked on the steamship to this village, Husli. Used to go to this village, and he used to talk to people, and when he would come home, he would tell about them. And so she's talking about how she sees the young kids and asks them who your grandparents were, and that way she feels like she knows them. But anyway, this is... Okay, I'm about to say something profound.
God bless you, everyone.
Yeah, that guy is the father of one of the people who was killed. She was comforting him. And so this has an incorporated noun for suffering. The passive of the causative forms. I'm not going to bother to explain that. I'm getting short of time. She also said this, nosit stochlia. This is classificatory stem for plural objects, referring to the people. So you would be like you plural, you guys. So it's something like your breath's returning home. May your breaths go back home. And actually this is the last slide, so I can say that to you. Nosit stochlia. May you go home breathing, I guess. I was trying to remember. Oh, I was going to. I won't. Don't bother to ask me. I'll go ahead and tell you about the observation thing. One time I was taking this Khoisan woman home in Fairbanks, and she lived in a trailer park. And before you got to the trailer park, there's a neighborhood that had frame houses, but they were like 1 story and long, so they looked like trailers, but they weren't. And then there were telephone poles there. In Alaska, whenever you put something in the ground or in it, it sinks because the permafrost melts. And so the telephone lines between the poles over time, as the poles sank and so on, drooped. So you have a telephone line like that. The telephone wire would go like that. And she said, you know what, if I'm going to make a riddle about this, what I would say. And of course I knew that she had made a riddle and was about to tell me. And she said, it looks like a lot of fish got caught in the net. They have different kinds of nets, but one of them you have floats, floating on the water. The line's attached, and so they're taut. But when fish get caught in the net, they weigh, have weight to them, and so they pull down the net, and the floats don't sink, but the lines between, the heavy line between the floats is pulled down, so it looks like that. And so the idea of fish, the fish were kind of roughly the same shape as the houses that these people were living in. A lot of them were from the villages, the Oscar villages, kind of getting there, getting caught in the net of the city or something. And so it was like it was a riddle, but it had a kind of expressing a deeper meaning. And very often people will do this. They're not exactly called riddles necessarily, but these observations using the same kind of power to draw relations between things. This other woman, when she came to Fairbanks from the village to see a doctor or something, in the place where she came from didn't have stoplights or even cars or roads to it, but just so she was looking at the cars lining up at the stoplight, and she says it's like bullets being loaded into a gun. So again, you have these metallic objects sort of lining up in a row, ready to shoot out when you pull the trigger. Okay, so I did have time to say that, and I actually have time for some questions or comments too. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of the morphemes were just thematic prefixes.
Yeah, well, that means I don't want to talk about it. They mean various things.
Is it just that is it just kind of like a socially understood thing between speakers of the language?
Like this one, the di it's in this case used for class of things like sticks or things that are verbal or rigid objects. And so for some reason, the Yeats takes this. And I'm not sure if it could be extended, if it's something that extends or it's viewed as in a metaphorical way as being rigid. And then the thematic prefixes, what in the literature is called classifiers, are called classifiers, but they don't classify anything. It has to do with things like a voice, like middle voice, passive voice, valence, transitivity, which I don't want to bother explaining. Yeah.
So the last two little stories that you gave, they're kind of like pithy, clever analogies.
Yeah.
Are those kind of translations of words that exist? Were they translating them into English?
Oh, yeah. And actually, they're both set in Koikan originally. But I didn't write them down, and so I didn't want to try to reconstruct them. Yeah.
When it comes to the stories, those very long stories,
Yeah.
is there a tendency for elderly people to be the ones who tell them? And are you aware of any content analysis that anyone's ever done on those stories? Because someone did that for Nunamute stories like that to the north and came up with some really interesting insights.
A content analysis looking for what?
Trying to, in a sense, I hate to use the term, but deconstruct the meaning that's within the story. And what Leah Mink did, who did the Nunamute sagas, she called them, because like you indicated, they can take days to tell, were typically told by elders. And they have all kinds of mythic themes and everything, and you can really get caught up in those details. But when you break them down to a content analysis, she said what they were really were they were roadmaps for what to do when the caribou don't show up, their main source of food. So they were like survival tales told by the elderly to the young.
Yeah, I in terms of the long stories, I actually, people have, and I wrote about an article about this called something in iconicity in Koikan shamanistic stories. So the story that takes a week to tell is of this genre where so it talks about someone becoming a medicine person, which is really what these stories are about, but that's never actually said when telling the stories. It's just understood. And so traditionally you would, becoming a medicine person, you would sleep a lot and dream. And you would be dreaming of encounters you would have after you would wake up. And each encounter would test your skills and would become more challenging as time went by. And so in one of these, and the story that takes 3 weeks to tell is one of these stories. Like he sleeps all the time, and then he encounters, like the camp robber people. The initial stories are very similar in structure. Like he becomes something, there's some, to some group of people, has an encounter with them, there's something a little odd about them, but it's very stereotyped, very similar in structure. And then in the middle of the story, he camps and invents the canoe. Like in the first part, he's walking in the winter. The second part, he's canoeing in the summer. And after that, the stories get weirder and weirder. There's one, for one encounter, is called the one who was married to his own hand. And he like gives birth to like baby rabbits by pulling them out of his hand, having impregnated his hand. And the initial stories are basically he encounters them, spends the night, eats some weird food and leaves, and then something weird happens to them. Like they all turn into camp robbers or something. Now, in these stories, sometimes the idea is you get back home after this journey, and then you're a strong medicine person. But people don't always make it back. So the story that takes a week, he doesn't make it back. He this is a little indelicate, but there's this giant woman that he encounters, and he wants to make love to her. And she says, no, I'm too big, but he insists, and then he's like, I apologize, everyone. But he's like sucked in and drowns, and then he comes out as like a woodpecker with a red head. Did that answer your question? I kind of
Not exactly, but it was a heck of a story.
Yeah.
Is the stem fairly consistent in all cases, always staying at the end, or does it vary as well?
Yeah, the stems at the end, you can have a few suffixes. It'd be like nominalizers, turn things into nouns, make something into a question. Another one means don't do that, whatever it is. But usually have a stem and then a bunch of prefixes, which you can imagine makes it very difficult to come up with a useful dictionary for one of these languages. Yeah.
I was thinking about what you were saying about Jacobson, was it Jacobson?
Yeah, right.
Rebelling against language's structure, and I'm thinking in English, maybe some of the free-form verse that we have that kind of ignores grammatical rules.
Right.
Or even somebody like David Foster Wallace, whose prose just combines things and goes on and on and on. And I'm wondering, or maybe even using dialects of English that aren't standard or accepted in standard, grammar. And I'm wondering if do you think that's kind of what he's talking about, and if there are similar ways of stretching and pulling and meddling with language's rules here in these examples?
Well, I don't want to defend Jacobson's position, because I'm not sure about it, but I think he would say, you had several things in there, but in the case of free verse, that would be an example of rebelling against form. So it's anti-grammatical, but not agrammatical, he would say. In terms of different dialects, any linguist would say those have structure and form as well. And so whatever the structure form is for that dialect, that would be grammatical. Oh, by the way, I want to let's pause for a commercial break. Next semester I'm teaching Anthropology L400, Ethnography, Communication Seminar. And I plan to focus on creative use of language cross-culturally and looking at differences, but also some of the Jakobson stuff or similarities, things that reoccur. And we'll look at Koyukon just because I love it, and probably some other things, sign language, maybe Navajo. But really what languages we look at will depend on who signs up for it and what they're interested in. So please sign up for that because I don't want it to be canceled. Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question playing off of what Nora just asked.
Yeah.
This idea of a good poem being one that has the structure but is also rebelling against the structure. Mm-hmm. I read some things about music. I know you're also a musician, that good music cannot simply follow the rules, let's say, of Western music. It's boring. There always has to be some discordance in there, and that's what makes it interesting. And would you care to comment about how cross-cultural that might be with respect to music?
Yeah, I know, that's a really good point. And one thing that kind of bothers me about Jakobson's statement is it's either grammatical or anti-grammatical, but it's both in a sense. One time, Mike Cole, who did the work on Vi literacy, some of you may have read his work, but I heard him once say that in order to be creative, you have to be within a system, but not at the center of the system. And so you have to, in order for your creativity to be understood and accepted by others, they have to be part of it. They have to be able to relate to it. It has to be within this context, but also it's pushing things as well. And so, the work that some of you read, the work that George Lakoff did on metaphor, and one of the work he did on poetic metaphor, not just the day-to-day use of metaphor, but the way poets use it, is they use the metaphors that are common in day-to-day life, but they use them in novel or unusual ways. So very often we speak of death as departure, like he passed away, passed on, and so on. But when people kind of look at things in a different way, you can kind of play on that. Like Emily Dickinson, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. If you read that poem, she talks about a number of the metaphors for death, but she uses them in kind of an unusual way. And it's the same thing with music as well. It's like something that's really unusual or creative and pushes things. Related to that, someone once told me about song composition. All happy songs should have a little bit of sad in them, and all sad songs should have a little bit of happy in them. And so there's someone, like you totally within the context, the structure of sadness, it totally is ineffective.